So, in case you're new to the channel, the software we've been developing builds maps like this, all procedurally generated. You can specify things like ocean coverage and latitude range, and then the whole map gets built out of vector calculus and linear algebra. The terrain looks pretty decent, and we can also assign climates and lakes and rivers and biomes, and in our last video, we started thinking about settlement locations. Here are a bunch of locations where settlements might make sense. That is, these are the locations where there's enough resources for a settlement to be economically viable, but where the habitability is the highest in its little local neighborhood. Right now, we're attempting to identify every possible settlement location, so there are way too many of them on this map. Let's delete some at random to cut down on the visual clutter. The remaining locations are pretty uniform over the map, which isn't very realistic, but this is what we get when we're doing everything with uniform random selection. Let's say that a couple are big metropolises, a few are large cities, and the rest are smaller towns. Again, I'm doing this all just at random, so the big squares in the southeast corner and the southern peninsula, those are the metropolises isolated from everything else on the map, and the rest of the size distribution doesn't have any spatial pattern to it. And finally, let's slap some various fantasy-flavored names on these cities. The names aren't very good, but we'll worry about that in a later video. But just starting to add a variety of city sizes and then starting to add names to things already makes this feel more like a map of a place that stories could happen. We can imagine societies living here and adventures happening here. But we've used a lot of unstructured uniform randomness to get this set of cities, and the result is that they're spatially distributed in a way that's quite uniform, but not very interesting. And their size distribution doesn't really make sense when you think about it. We probably want to do a little bit better than this by ensuring that our map has some wild areas, some densely settled areas, and also we'd want nearby clusters of cities to fall into natural hierarchies. And of course, we want to do all that while preserving some sense that we're generating the map of a heightened fantasy world. I feel like I've talked about this series a few times now, but this kind of interesting distribution of city sizes and specializations is a big part of what makes the world of the craft sequence feel interesting and makes the places feel varied. City-state like Alt Colum feels very different from a much larger city-state like Drosidia Lex, which feels very different from a small island community like Cavacana, which feels very different from a big city under colonial occupation like Agdal Lex / Alicant, which feels very different from a small farming town like Edgemont. Every one of these places has their own distinct flavor, but they also fit into different tiers in the hierarchies of local communities. Drosidia Lex is huge and sprawling and surrounded by wilderness, for example, whereas Alt Colum seems to have a hinterland of smaller settlements. And that variety also means that when a city is in mortal danger, which happens at the climax of pretty much every one of these books, you get a sense of just how big that city is and how devastating that threat should feel. Of course, not every fantasy world needs to show off a whole tour of cities like this, but I think it does help to build out that world-building iceberg. It's all going to be there even if the characters aren't going to see it. And in the context of, for example, a TTRPG campaign, having a huge metropolis with a sprawling hinterland of smaller settlements, or having an isolated city far from the rest of society, or having vast wild areas on the map, really helps expand the range of settings the characters can encounter, or the stories they can choose to collectively tell. So let's start heading down that route. Welcome back to Multiversal Map Room. This week, we're allocating sizes to cities. In particular, for each of those hundreds of potential settlement locations we generated for each map, we want to answer two questions. Is there a city there? And if so, how large is that city? And of course, we could just assign all these things at random, like I showed in the intro. But for interesting world building and storytelling, there are certain principles that help give us a better distribution. These principles are unavoidably going to be a blend of genre conventions, storytelling optimization, and real-world social science. The first principle is that we want unsettled areas without permanent settlements. You might think about this as a wilderness, or it might be wastelands or ruin or something else. Basically, there should be meaningful areas on the map without a lot of marked settlements. This kind of unsettled area is a big part of how old school TTRPGs worked, and so it sometimes has an era of mapping out hex grids and fighting random monsters and looting ancient cities. But if you want a magical world with heightened fantasy elements, it does help to have parts of the world where unexpected and magical things can happen, and threats can build without anyone immediately noticing. Moreover, unevenly distributed settlement patterns are an important part of real-world geography, and the fact that cities aren't just plunked down uniformly on a map gives it a sense of looking intuitively more realistic. The second principle is that clusters of nearby cities should fall into a hierarchy. If you have a bunch of settlements very close to each other, one should be the largest and most important, and the others in the cluster nearby should be smaller. This one comes straight from social sciences. This is the kind of pattern that geography and economics tend to produce in the real world. In a given region or a given country, you end up with a small number of really big cities and then a bunch of smaller settlements nearby. For our purposes, adopting this has two main advantages. First off, it gives us the map that looks intuitively reasonable, because we're used to seeing that kind of hierarchy of places in the real world. And second, it gives us easy statistical patterns we can use to fill in the populations of all the settlements in a cluster without having to overthink it. The third and final principle is that we generally want to have some large isolated cities somewhere on the map. Some settlements of meaningful size should be spatially separate from the rest of the settlements. And this one doesn't really have a real-world analog. It purely comes from epic fantasy storytelling, and cities like Sky and Camor and Baldur's Gate as big, isolated fantasy cities. This kind of spatial isolation isn't super common in the real world, but in novels and TTRPGs it gives rationale for long travel and a sense of remove from the rest of the world. I actually tried building maps without these isolated cities, and they didn't have that same sense of like a heightened fantasy setting, so we're keeping these in. So how do we go from this set of settlements to a smaller set that brings us closer to matching these principles? We're going to start out with those radii we drew around each settlement location in the last video. Recall that these circles give us a sense of how much land a settlement would need to control to be economically viable. A settlement right around a mine, or a source of arcane energy, or the mouth of a river might need less land than a settlement that's surrounded by farms and forest, for example, whereas a settlement in the middle of arid mountains might need more land to be economically viable. And in places where the circles substantially overlap, that's a sign that these settlements are in some sense economically tied to each other. So we can go ahead and treat each set of overlapping circles as a cluster of settlements that in some sense work together economically. Here are all the clusters we get on this sample map. I've tried to color each cluster differently here, but there are so many that it's hard to give them all distinct colors. But we end up with settlements being grouped into clusters of very different sizes and physical geographies. Here's the largest cluster of settlements on this map. These settlement locations are fairly densely clustered all along the mountains and highlands, and checking the resource layer, it looks like some of these settlements are very close to large mines as well. So maybe this could end up being a collection of relatively industrial mining towns with a strong centralized administration. And here's another slightly smaller cluster of settlements. This one is concentrated along the shore of a lake and a river feeding into that lake, so this might be a set of farming communities and maybe like one significant trading center. I'm giving examples of what these could be, but ultimately the whole goal of writing procedurally generated map-making software is giving you the map so that you can look at it and start building a world based on what you see. And finally, some of the clusters consist of a single settlement location. These are near enough resources that they become economically viable far away from any other settlement locations. Once again, in the real world, isolated communities like this, far from other large settlements, don't tend to get very large. But for that larger-than-life fantasy world feeling, we want to leave open the possibility that some of these do become large cities. Hopefully this gives a sense of why it's natural to think of these clusters as a building block when we start assigning city size and hierarchy. And of course, as always, there's nothing unique about this specific map. We could generate another map with different terrain and apply the same principles. Here's another map generated using a different seed to the pseudo-random number generator. This one has a lot more islands and separate continents, separated by shallow seas. The potential settlement locations are spread out over the land masses, with many of them along the coastlines. Because of this very different geography, when we draw the radii for these settlements, many more of them are isolated, especially along the coasts. This means we end up with more singleton clusters and just a couple large clusters of settlements. Here's one of the largest, which is spread out over the southwest coastline of that big eastern continent. It's a little smaller than the biggest clusters on that previous map because this map's physical geography gives fewer places where a bunch of settlements' radii of economic extraction overlap. Here's the set of singleton clusters that contain only one settlement. As you can see, a lot more potential for large isolated cities on this map, especially on the islands in the northwest. Now that we've established that these clusters arguably make sense as a unit for assigning city size, how do we go about actually implementing those principles we talked about earlier? As a first step, we're going to set a target number of settlement locations that will actually be populated places shown on the map, and then we'll delete clusters of settlement locations one cluster at a time until we hit our target number of inhabited settlements. We'll prioritize keeping large clusters because these are probably interesting locations for storytelling and they give us a chance to say something about a hierarchy of smaller settlements around a major metropolis, but we'll also make sure to keep at least a few isolated one settlement clusters because that's how we get those isolated cities that maybe aren't realistic but are cool in a fantasy setting. When we do that for this map, here's what we end up with. The geography of this map with all its separate islands really separates out the clusters already, but we do end up with clusters of inhabited settlements on every major landmass, including some fairly isolated city locations. If we go back to this map from the beginning and do the same cluster by cluster deletion to hit the target count of inhabited settlements, the fact that it's all on one big continent without a lot of natural separation makes the results look much more drastic. Specifically, in this case, the random deletion has left us with a lot of settled areas to the southwest of that big central plateau, and a range of settlements in the north, but a big empty wilderness in between with no permanent settlements. You might think that's an interesting area for adventures to happen, or it might even be tempting to draw that in as a border between two rival civilizations. Maybe something like this, but we're not quite at the point in this project where we can start drawing political borders yet, so let's not think about that for now. And this is a big advantage of procedurally generated mapmaking, right? You want to build a world that's interesting for telling larger-than-life fantasy stories, and you want to be able to shape that world to some extent, but you don't necessarily want a world that's overly neat and tidy for the story you're telling. This is especially true for TTRPG campaigns, where you want the world to have more places in it than you'd initially planned to visit. This random cluster-wise deletion gives us some interesting empty areas on the map that we wouldn't necessarily have seen if we sat down and tried to design the map specifically to tell the story we wanted to tell. To show an even more extreme example of cluster-by-cluster settlement deletion generating some surprising results, here's yet another map with a big landmass in the north and the edge of a continent to the south. Incidentally, I'm working on tweaking map generation so that we get fewer maps with big land masses along the edges like this. You might have noticed that I've tweaked how rivers and coastlines generate since the last video, and I am feeling better about that, but the overall macro shape of the continent is still a work in progress. Anyway, if we do that same cluster by cluster random deletion to get a reasonable number of settlements on this map, what does it look like? It turns out we're left mostly with clusters right along rivers and coastlines, plus a couple in the very high mountains. The ones in the mountains are generally near mines and have really low habitability scores. To me, this is an interesting and unexpected result. the inhabited places are mostly right along the river valleys or up in the high mountains. What does that divide look like? What kind of stories would happen in this world? Anyway, now that we've winnowed down the set of all possible settlement locations to a more reasonable set of inhabited clusters, we need to assign populations to each of those inhabited settlements. I'm doing this fairly simply with a two-stage process. First, I'm picking the largest settlement in each cluster. In general, more often than not, this should be at a prime location, like a high habitability, high resource river delta, because that's where the dominant cities in a lot of real-world clusters tend to happen. But, of course, we don't want to be fully deterministic here because plenty of real-world large important cities aren't in these optimal locations. Beijing, Berlin, Baghdad are all huge and important, not just due to their physical geography, but also due to the importance of their historical positions within China, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Caliphate. So we're going to pick the largest settlement at random, but weighted towards factors like high habitability and high potential as a trade port. We then assign this largest settlement a population, also at random, but based on its cluster size, its habitability, and its natural resources. And then, once we have the largest settlement in each cluster, we can start filling in the rest of the settlements in randomly chosen descending order from there, according to Zipf's law. This is an empirical rule of thumb based on 20th century statistical analysis that states that the second largest city should be about half the size of the largest, the third largest should be about one-third the size of the largest, and so on. Calling this a law is massively overselling it. This relationship between rank and size might just be something you get from sorting randomly sized cities. But insofar as it's a nice empirical regularity, it lets us fill in the settlement populations for the rest of the cluster in a plausibly realistic way after assigning a population for the largest one. So if we go back to this map, what does it look like to assign the largest settlement by cluster? Let's use that logic we've just described to assign the largest settlement, where it's random, but with our thumb on the scale for somewhere habitable, and also maybe a reasonable port location. I'm going to show the location of the largest settlement in each cluster with a star, and here's how that looks. As expected, most of the largest cities in the clusters are high habitability natural port locations. But, of course, that can't happen up in the mountains, and now it's an interesting world-building exercise to think about what could be going on in all those remote, arid, inland mountain settlements. Each singleton cluster is, by definition, its own largest settlement, which is why you see those isolated stars in various parts of the map. We can repeat that same process of assigning the largest settlement for this map with the islands. The clusters here are mostly pretty small, so there's not a lot of choice in which settlement gets assigned as the largest. When we're assigning the largest settlements in a cluster, we're deliberately not looking at any kind of measure of centrality within that cluster. The largest settlement can absolutely be at one end of a cluster of connected settlements, if that's how the cluster developed, or if that's what came to make the most sense economically. For example, if you look at the southern coast of that big eastern continent, you can see that this has happened where the largest settlement of the cluster is the furthest west. This feels plausibly realistic, and it increases the potential for story settings that are close to a lot of other settlements, but not necessarily the largest and most important city around. Overall, I think this assignment of largest settlements has enough randomness to keep these procedurally generated maps feeling realistic and plausible, but not overly designed and optimized. And finally, we can do the same assignment for the map from the beginning of the video, which had fewer larger clusters. Again, these tend to be inhabitable and economically viable locations, although for that big central cluster up in the mountains, pretty much none of these locations have really high habitability. From here, we can assign populations, first by generating a population for the largest settlement based on local habitability and economic resources, and then by filling in the populations of all the other settlements according to Zipf's law, which isn't actually a law, but just a convenient statistical rule of thumb we can use to fill in these populations. Here's how that looks for this map. I've dropped the colors for the different clusters because that was making things too busy, and I divided the settlements into 5 different size categories. Under the hood, of course, these are all continuous numerical values, so you can divide them up however you like. Anyway, by putting some structure on the distribution of these settlements and not just populating them at random, we've gotten some interesting discrete patterns that might be useful for various storytelling purposes. We've already talked about that big gap between the southeastern settlements and the other settlements on the other side of the mountains, but let's look at the population distribution as well. The largest cluster, way up in the mountains, has turned out to be relatively sparsely populated, with a lot of small hamlets. And this makes sense because the way that we're assigning populations in big clusters like this means that you're going to end up with a lot of smaller settlements around the biggest city, and also in this case the biggest city isn't huge because it's not in a super habitable or geographically prosperous location. Meanwhile, several of the rivers along the northwest coast had smaller clusters because the economic radii were smaller up here, and these smaller clusters ended up with higher population large settlements because they had higher habitability and more resources around them. So this coastal area with lots of resources and river ports and high habitability ends up being the most densely populated part of the map, which is the kind of result that we'd hope for. We can repeat the same exercise with the map from earlier with all the islands. Here, the procedural generation has given us more mid-sized settlements, and a lot of small coastal villages, with just a couple big metropolises right at the mouths of rivers. This isn't necessarily what I would have expected just by looking at the map, but it does make sense, and I think this would work really well as a setting for, say, a pirate-themed TTRPG campaign. Finally, this map with the big central ocean ended up with decently sized cities way up in the mountains, and then one built-up area right around that central bay. This is a map where the population of the northern continent is pretty heavily concentrated in one relatively small region, with one metropolis-tier settlement right there on the shoreline. What's going on there? What would it look like for a story to be set there? This is motivating me to spend a future week modeling how land use might work, especially around the most populated settlements. Right now, all these settlements are just single pixels represented by dots on a map, but adding hinterlands of intensive agricultural and manufacturing land use feels like it might add some depth, so it's not just natural biomes and settlements with nothing else in between. But for now, that's all for this week. As always, I'm grateful for feedback and suggestions, so don't hesitate to leave a reply. The next few weeks of this project are going to be a continued deep dive into urban geography, so if you have any feedback on anything about cities, please let me know. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you next time.